evening. I'm Teresa Skubik, and this is Forum Daily for Wednesday, March 12th. U.S. President Donald Trump has officially slapped 25% tariffs on all steel and aluminum imports, including from Canada. While Canada was previously exempt from the tariffs introduced in 2018, that exemption has now been lifted. Mr. Trump has promised that the taxes will help create U.S. factory jobs at a time when he's seesawing tariff threats are jolting the stock market and raising fears on an economic slowdown. Ontario Premier Doug Ford says he and Federal Finance Minister Dominic LeBlanc will travel to Washington tomorrow after being invited by U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick to discuss trade concerns.
We have both agreed, let cooler heads prevail. We need to sit down and move this forward. This is a massive, massive deal, the USMCA, which the federal government will be leading the charge. I'll be sitting down with all our premiers tomorrow as well and discussing this and their issues as well. So we're going to go down there and we're going to go down there with confidence. We're going to go down there with strength. And again, hopefully we can move this forward. The worst thing that could happen is wait and let this drag out until April the 2nd. So we're going to move forward and have a very good conversation with Secretary Lutnick and the whole trade team, as he said, and hopefully we can move this forward because it doesn't benefit anyone.
When asked about the sparring between his administration and Ontario Premier Doug Ford, Mr. Trump called Mr. Ford, quote, a good man, but doubled down on making Canada a 51st state and complained about the border, calling it an artificial line.
Now, I will say this, that already Canada, and I respect very much, as you know, there's a very strong man in Canada who said he was going to charge a surcharge or a tariff on electricity coming into our country. He has called and he said he's not going to do that. Okay, he's not going to do that. And it would have been a very bad thing if he did, and he's not going to do that, so I respect that. But we were just informed that he's not going to do that. Look, we've been treated very unfairly by Canada. We've been treated very unfairly by Mexico. But we've been treated very unfairly by every country all over the world. The European Union is horrible, horrible. And we're going to get it back. And I have a choice. I could just coast, and eventually there'd be a blow-up down the road, maybe a long way. But we owe $36 trillion, and we're going to get it back. We're the biggest, we're the best, and I'm very optimistic. I have to tell you, I'm very optimistic about. We give Canada $200 billion a year. We subsidize Canada between all of the things we give them and trade. We give them, we don't have to have cars made in Canada. We don't have to have lumber from Canada. We have tremendous lumber. We have tremendous trees. All I have to do is unfreeze them from some of the restrictions that we're putting on. I can do that with an executive order. We don't need energy. We have more energy than anybody else in the world. So we spend $200 billion a year subsidizing Canada. We don't have to do that. And frankly, the way that gets solved is Canada should honestly become our 51st state. We wouldn't have a northern border problem. We wouldn't have a tariff problem. They don't have much. They spend very little, as you know, the least of almost anybody on military. And we spend the most of anybody on military. We have a great military. I rebuilt the military during my first time. We're going to have to rebuild it a little bit again. Not that much, but we're going to have to rebuild it a little bit again. But Canada would be great as our cherished 51st state. You wouldn't have to worry about borders. You wouldn't have to worry about anything. And by the way, Canada is very highly taxed, and we're very low tax. We're considered a low tax nation because of me, because I cut the taxes so low. So the people of Canada would pay much less tax. It makes a lot of sense. And by the way, when you take away that artificial line that looks like it was done with a ruler, and that's what it was. Some guy sat there years ago and they said, rah. Well, when you take away that, and you look at that beautiful formation of Canada and the United States, there is no place anywhere in the world that looks like that.
This morning, the federal government announced it will impose 25% tariffs on U.S. goods worth $29.8 billion. This is in retaliation for the 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum.
Together, we will do what we must do to protect Canada's economy. With these most recent tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, the U.S. administration is once again inserting disruption and disorder into an incredibly successful trading partnership and raising the costs of everyday goods for Canadians and American households alike. We will not stand idly by while our iconic steel and aluminum industries are being unfairly targeted. Today, I am announcing that the Government of Canada, following a dollar-for-dollar approach, will be imposing, as of 12:01 a.m. tomorrow, March 13th, 2025, 25% reciprocal tariffs on an additional $29.8 billion of imports from the United States. This includes steel products worth $12.6 billion and aluminum products worth $3 billion, as well as additional imported U.S. goods worth $14.2 billion for a total of $29.8 billion.
And following the announcement, Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly was asked by reporters how the federal government trusts the United States going into tomorrow's meeting.
I think the strategy is clear. We just need to make sure that we put maximum pressure to defend our jobs, defend our sovereignty, defend our way of living. But meanwhile, as a team negotiating, we need to find off-ramps. And it is just the right thing to do. So we'll do both. That conversation with Howard Lutnick is important. The ones we have, and I'll have with Secretary Rubio as well. So we're doing that in the best interest of Canadians.
While touring a steel plant in Hamilton, Ontario, incoming Prime Minister Mark Carney has reaffirmed his government will keep current tariffs on U.S. imports to Canada and explained that revenue from the tariffs will be used to help workers in impacted sectors.
The Minister of Finance, the Minister of Foreign Affairs are announcing that we will put in place reciprocal tariffs on U.S. steel, on U.S. aluminum, and on a series of other U.S. goods, so the total amount of our tariffs match the American tariffs. Now, we don't want to do this because we believe in open borders and free and fair trade, but we're doing this in response. The second thing is that we are going to make sure that all the proceeds from our tariffs go back to support workers in the affected industries. So in the steel industry, in the aluminum industry, and any other industry that the Americans may affect. In addition, we will double down on the partnerships that we have with the industry. As you know, a lot of the big investments here have been in partnership with the federal government, with the Ontario government, this so-called SIF fund is one example. We are proud of what you have accomplished. It's a remarkably competitive company. It's a world leader who's going to be here for another 30 years, another 30 years after that, another 30 years after that. And I know there's multi-generations of workers here, and your children and your children's children will have opportunities to work at Dofasco and ArcelorMittal.
Mr. Carney also spoke about Donald Trump, highlighting that he understands President Trump's concerns about American workers and fentanyl, but that he wants Trump to respect Canada's sovereignty.
We understand. I respect President Trump's concern for American workers and American families. We respect his concern about fentanyl. It's an issue for us here in Canada as well. And that's why the Canadian government moved very quickly with a comprehensive response that has had a huge, huge impact in terms of controlling that issue and getting on top of that issue much better. We are ready to sit down with the Americans, with the U.S. government. I'm ready to sit down with President Trump at the appropriate time under a position where there's respect for Canadian sovereignty, and we're working for a common approach, a much more comprehensive approach for trade. We're all going to be better off. Workers here in Canada, which is our concern, workers in America, which is his concern. We are all going to be better off when the greatest economic and security partnership in the world is renewed, relaunched. That's possible. You have a new government, but the same commitment, and that commitment is built rock solid on the commitment you have all made here at Dofasco.
A new poll suggests that Canadians' sense of national pride has surged in response to Donald Trump's tariffs and threats against the country's sovereignty. The online survey of over 1,500 Canadians conducted by Leger Marketing for the Association for Canadian Studies says that the share of respondents expressing pride in being Canadian has jumped to 86% since November. Pride is highest among people aged 55 and over at 92%, but 75% of people aged 18 to 34 also said that they were proud to be Canadian. Coming up after the break, Canada's stock index suffers continued losses for a second day in a row. U.S. President Trump blames the Biden administration and the ongoing war in Ukraine and Gaza. We'll have these stories and more news right after the break. After a brutal stock market sell-off on Monday, Canada's main stock index continued losses on Tuesday, with U.S. markets also falling off with tariff tensions between the two countries mounting. The S&P TSX Composite Index closed down 132 points on Tuesday. And in New York, markets briefly fell 10% below records set last month. When pressed about the market sell-off, Donald Trump blamed the Biden administration and the wars in Ukraine and between Israel and Hamas.
Mr. President, you mentioned the ups and downs in the stock market. You said it'll go up, it'll go down. But do you and your tariff policies right now bear any responsibility for the turmoil we're seeing this week?
Biden gave us a horrible economy. He gave us horrible inflation. And I think the market was going to go very, very bad. If anything, I have a lot of very smart people, friends of mine and great businessmen. They're now investing because of what I'm doing. Because long term, what I'm doing is making our country strong again, financially strong, militarily strong, and strong if we want to get away. Remember this, we have wars. When I left, we had no wars. We didn't have Ukraine and Russia. We didn't have October 7th. We didn't have that disaster that took place with the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And you look at what's happened there. We caught the major terrorist, which Biden wouldn't have caught. Why didn't he catch him? I caught him. 5 weeks into the presidency, I caught the man responsible for Abiegate. And he's going to pay hell right now. He's a bad dude. He's a bad guy. But we didn't have these problems. I had no inflation. I had a great economy. He gave you high prices. You couldn't buy bacon. You couldn't buy anything. And also, I inherited a situation with eggs. The price of eggs was through the roof. Well, now the price of eggs has come down a lot. Interest rates have come down. Gasoline prices have come down. It's all coming down. It's all a beautiful thing. I can do it the right way or the wrong way. We're doing it the right way. And I have tremendous confidence in this country and the people of this country. Tremendous confidence, much more so than if I sat back for 4 years and had a good time in the Oval Office.
While holding a news conference in Montreal to announce his party's candidate for the Laurier-Sainte-Marie riding, Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet also spoke about the change in U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum, doubling from 25% to 50% on Tuesday before the tariffs were put on hold. When asked about Mr. Trump's decision, Mr. Blanchet called it, quote, the proof of his failure.
If he believed that 25% were hard enough on us to have us bend the knee, he would be satisfied with that. But now is 50% on aluminum and steel because he uses some Quebec interest to avenge himself against Ontario, which is weird. He would never say something so stupid as to say, okay, 250% tariffs on milk and on lumberwood, 250%. What else? That's the proof of the fact that his policies haven't worked. And he doesn't have much time before his own economy, inflation and markets show him that this has already lasted long enough. And he's got to sit at the table and start a serious negotiation, because this is the only way to do things for United States, Mexico, Canada, and Quebec.
Canadian dairy farmers worry that the Trump administration has Canada's supply management system in its crosshairs. A Quebec farmer says that without supply management, the U.S. dairy industry could flood the country in a minute. He says U.S. producers have advantages in the form of cheaper labor, often in the form of undocumented immigrants. The Canada-U.S.-Mexico free trade deal is scheduled for review next year. Our news director, David Clement, has more on why Canada's dairy farmers are concerned.
Thank you for that, Teresa. It's really important to note here that the dairy farmers are not necessarily concerned with Trump's announcement of reciprocal tariffs on Canada's dairy industry. So President Trump has said he wants to increase tariffs on Canadian dairy to match what Canada has, which is in and around the range of 250%. Now, that's not flat across the board. It is complicated, but generally speaking, that is true. So Canadian dairy farmers are not necessarily concerned about that tariff from the Trump administration because the Canadian market does not provide milk for the U.S. market because supply management is a program that really insulates the industry so that its sole purpose is to provide the Canadian market with milk. Now, what they are concerned about is if the Trump administration is going to want the Canadian government to make concessions on supply management in the lead up to the renegotiation of the USMCA. So, quick reminder here for folks who don't know, supply management is a system of quotas and tariffs, quotas meaning permission to produce a product, and tariffs to limit international competition. So if Canada were to make concessions on supply management in those negotiations with the Trump administration, what that would mean is that Canadian dairy farmers would have to compete with dairy farmers in the United States in terms of the milk on grocery store shelves in Canada. So their concerns are that if we remove supply management, they're going to have to compete with U.S. product. U.S. product is often anywhere from 20 to 30% cheaper depending on the year. That fluctuates. In Canada, the price of milk is more stable than in the United States. But in the United States, despite the volatility, it is on average around 20 to 30% cheaper depending on the year. So they're worried they're going to have to compete on price. And that would be their concern in terms of supply management. However, it is important to note that there is research that suggests that getting rid of supply management would not actually be a net negative for the Canadian dairy industry. And so the reason why it could be explained in that way is that supply management limits our farmers' ability to export their goods abroad. And so right now, Canada does not really export a lot of anything that's supply managed: milk, chicken, eggs, cheese, etc. If we were to ease up on the restrictions regarding supply management, or even get rid of it, if that was something that the Trump administration was advocating for, we could see an opportunity where there would be export opportunities for dairy farmers that never existed before. And it's important to note that the demand for things like milk, as the global middle class has grown, demand for milk has significantly increased. And there is a case study from New Zealand where they had their own system of supply management and ended up getting rid of it and have become a large player in the export market for milk. And so that case study is in 1983. They got rid of supply management in their dairy sector. At the time, they exported around $4.3 billion in milk. Come to 2023, so 3 decades later, it's skyrocketed to $43.4 billion in exports. And so New Zealand, for those who argue against supply management, is a case study of where getting rid of these rules allows for domestic producers to become exporters. And rather than serving a market of 40 million in Canada, they can compete on the global stage. And so the concerns about supply management, yes, the dairy farmers would have to compete with U.S. product if the Trump administration is looking for concessions. but there may be opportunities for them, if that happens, to enter the export market, like has happened with New Zealand farmers.
NDP leader Jagmeet Singh was in Esquimalt, BC on Tuesday to introduce the NDP candidate for Esquimalt Saanich Sooke in the next federal election. During his address, he spoke about the NDP's plan for Canada going forward, as well as highlighting the plans for the other parties. In addition to condemning Mark Carney's plan to cut federal workers and healthcare services, Mr. Singh also targeted Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, calling him the pick of U.S. billionaire Elon Musk, making him the favored choice of the Trump administration.
And what about Pierre Poilievre? What's his plan? Well, Pierre Poilievre is the pick of Elon Musk. Elon Musk has endorsed Pierre Poilievre, and it is shown, and Pierre Poilievre has accepted that endorsement. So it shows that he is the choice of the Trump administration. The very administration that has threatened our sovereignty, threatened our workers, threatened Canadians, he's accepted that endorsement. So we can't expect him to stand up for Canadians. He is chosen by that administration as their guy in Ottawa, their guy here in Canada.
A new Leger online poll suggests the federal Liberals and the Conservatives are running neck and neck in voter support. The poll of just over 1,500 Canadians' voting intentions last week shows both parties sitting at roughly 37% each. It's a drop for the Conservatives and a bump for the Liberals after lagging behind the Conservatives for nearly 2 years. All right, stay tuned. When we come back from the break, we'll turn to the EU announcing its own countermeasures to U.S. tariffs.
As of this morning, the United States is applying a 25% tariff on imports of steel and aluminum. We deeply regret this measure. The countermeasures we take today are strong but proportionate.
The EU has announced its own countermeasures to U.S. tariffs beginning on April 1st, after the Trump administration increased tariffs on all steel and aluminum imports to 25% this morning.
As of this morning, the United States is applying a 25% tariff on imports of steel and aluminum. We deeply regret this measure. The countermeasures we take today are strong but proportionate. As the United States are applying tariffs worth $28 billion, we are responding with countermeasures worth 26 billion euros. This matches the economic scope of the tariffs of the United States.
The Trump administration says it's lifting a suspension of military aid to Ukraine and intelligence sharing with Kyiv. The announcement comes a week after the measures were imposed to push Ukraine to enter talks to end the war with invading Russian forces. In a statement, Ukraine also said it was open to a 30-day ceasefire in the war. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said that the discussions in Jeddah had been positive and that the ball is now in Russia's court.
We'll have contact with them today. There's already been contacts at different levels with counterparts, different members of the administration, and that'll continue. But as far as the Russian reaction to it, that's really the question here. And that is, this is a few hours old. We're going to bring it to them directly. We're going to say that Ukraine is prepared to stop all battlefield activity and begin the immediate process of negotiating an enduring end to the war. And we'll see what their response is. If their response is yes, then we know we've made real progress and there's a real chance of peace. If their response is no, it would be highly unfortunate and it would make their intentions clear. So that's what we're hoping to hear from them. And obviously, as I said, that this was not prearranged for them. So they're probably processing the news the same as the rest of the world is. So we hope to have a positive answer from them. The ball is truly in their court.
A Manhattan federal court heard arguments today in a lawsuit challenging the detention of Mahmoud Khalil, a Columbia University graduate student that the Trump administration is trying to deport over his role in pro-Palestinian protests at the school last year. Columbia University graduate Katie Area joined us earlier for more on what it was like to be a Jewish student at Columbia during the protests.
Well, Columbia University has been a breeding ground for terror support since very soon after the October 7th attack on innocent Israeli civilians. On October 12th, there was the first protest that was against Israel and their actions, even though they were still counting the bodies from October 7th. And since then, the protests have continued getting worse and worse with time. In April of 2024. Mahmoud Khalil was one of the ringleaders of the encampment that took over my campus for over 2 weeks. They violently took over a building, broke in with hammers, held a facilities worker hostage, and continued to terrorize not just Jewish students, but all students on our campus. They claimed to be Westerners advocating for the total eradication of Western civilization. Their one goal was to disrupt and destruct everything. They call for death to the West, death to America, death to the Jews. And they were promoting not only violence, but terrorist ideals, including distributing explicit Hamas propaganda.
Now, the case largely comes down to free speech protections under the U.S. Constitution. Katie shared her perspective on that debate.
I'm personally a big proponent of free speech, but free speech does not give you a right to discriminate and to harass and to promote terrorist ideals. There is a fine line between being able to voice your opinions, and obviously we are blessed in the West to be able to voice our opinions, even if they contradict that of our governments. But to explicitly promote terrorist ideals, to idolize terrorists, such as Yahya Sinwar, who orchestrated the massacre on October 7th, to hand out posters with his quotes calling for a flood, which is what Hamas referred to the October 7th massacre as, explicitly showing and promoting these horrific ideals and handing out posters and propaganda that comes directly from these terrorist groups. They had photos of these terrorists in action. They brought members of terror supporting groups in New York City to campuses. It's just so beyond free speech at this point. It's just void of morality, void of values, and it's a threat to the security of the United States, just as it's a threat to the security of Canada. And frankly, governments have the moral and legal obligation to protect their citizens from harm. And part of that is removing individuals who have explicitly stated that they would like to destroy our country and what we stand for. I think it's important to emphasize that this is not just a Jewish or anti-Semitism or anti-Israel issue. This is a moral issue. This is a Western value-based issue. These individuals like Mahmoud Khalil have every intention to burn down America, to burn down Canada, to burn down Western civilization. And we should all, regardless of our religious identity, we should all be proud to stand very strong against individuals like this. And it is pure, just common sense to say that these individuals who are dangerous and pose a threat to citizens of Western civilizations should no longer be given the privilege to be amongst them.
Two Toronto police officers discussed the rise in interest towards Islam following the October 7th attack that is now a deleted podcast episode. The Toronto Sun's Brian Passafoom has more on the scandal.
Well, the video is part of a podcast series that Toronto Police produces through their Muslim liaison office called the Project Olive Branch. That's the name of the podcast. So their initial intent was to, I guess, raise awareness for Islamophobia. The podcast was hosted by two TPS Muslim outreach officers, Constable Farhan Ali and Constable Haroon Siddiqui. And what it turned into, the second episode, which was the one that kind of caused all the issues. And I want to say, by the way, like it wasn't uploaded to the podcast's official YouTube page. It was uploaded to Constable Ali's official Instagram page. It was split into 4 parts and uploaded. Yeah, some of the stuff they talked about caused a lot of eyebrows to go up and a lot of concern in the Jewish community. It was, for example, they were praising October 7th for a spike in converts to Islam, or as they call it, reverts, because Islam teaches that everybody is born Muslim at birth and they drift away from the faith, and that's why they refer to converts later in life as reverts, because you're reverting back to your natural state. And they also said a lot of really disturbing things about criticism of these anti-Israel protests, the ones you see in the street, people waving Hamas and Hezbollah flags, shouting anti-Semitic slogans, and they said that criticizing those events could be Islamophobia or anti-Palestinian racism, which I think is ludicrous. The two cops used a lot of what I would call DEI doublespeak, a lot of DEI terms like lived experiences and things like that. So quite clearly, this was an exercise in DEI politics that really run off the rails.
We also asked Brian about how the Toronto police have responded to the outrage.
Response has been initially it was rather shocking. It kind of followed a lot of the response that a lot of the terrible response that Toronto police has done since their questionable actions in enforcing the law at these protests. Initially, they just said that the podcast episode had been deleted. It didn't quite go how they wanted to, and they told me that's all they were prepared to say about it. I guess someone at Toronto Police, I guess, grew a brain and came to their senses and said maybe we should apologize for this, because their initial statement contained no apologies and no rationalization or any mention of the word Jewish at all. The statement that he tweeted later, a few hours after my story went viral, from the chief, said that Toronto Police understands the experiences of the Jewish community and the concerns of the Jewish community, and came forth with an apology. Unfortunately, it took Toronto Police's terrible response to this to this situation for that to happen. People were outraged at the situation and TPS's response, and this does is just draws more questions as to where TPS's heart is at. We see them, Toronto police officers, excusing a lot of blatant law breaking at these anti-Israel rallies, hate speech, overt anti-Semitism. So a lot of people in Toronto's Jewish community are going like, "What the heck?" It's and this is just another black eye in the face of Toronto police and their efforts to please everybody with everything.
Up next, the Bank of Canada announces its 7th consecutive rate cut.
Today, we lowered our policy interest rate by 25 basis points to 2.75%. The Canadian economy ended 2024 in good shape. Inflation has been close to the 2% target since last summer. Substantial cuts to our policy interest rate through the second half.
The Bank of Canada lowered its benchmark interest rate by a quarter point today as the tariff battle with the United States starts to weigh on the Canadian economy. The policy rate stands at 2.75% after the central bank's 7th consecutive rate cut.
Today, we lowered our policy interest rate by 25 basis points to 2.75%. The Canadian economy ended 2024 in good shape. Inflation has been close to the 2% target since last summer. Substantial cuts to our policy interest rate through the second half of last year boosted household spending and strengthened economic growth. However, in recent months, the pervasive uncertainty created by continuously changing U.S. tariff threats have shaken business and consumer confidence. This is restraining household spending intentions and businesses' plans to hire and invest. Against this backdrop, and with inflation near the 2% target, the Governing Council decided to reduce the policy rate a further 25 basis points. Looking ahead, the trade conflict with the United States can be expected to weigh on economic activity while also increasing prices and inflation. The Governing Council will proceed carefully with any further changes to our policy rate, given the need to assess both the upward pressure on inflation from higher costs and the downward pressure from weaker demand.
Experts say that it would cushion the economy against new tariffs, as America's new trade war with Canada has been dampening consumer and business confidence. Economist Dr. Moshe Lander joined us earlier for more on the announcement.
This is the 7th cut in a row. So we're now about 45 weeks into continuous interest rate cuts. It's mirroring the interest rate increases we saw a few years ago. It's just not as steep as it was going up. But the Bank of Canada clearly feels that inflation is under control for now. They're clearly worried about the state of the Canadian economy going forward with the tariff threats and the counter threats and just the uncertainty. So the interest rate cut this time was widely expected, but I don't know necessarily that I agreed with the timing of the cut. I thought that they could have held off for a little bit longer, but the Bank of Canada clearly feels that even if the tariffs do come into play, there's no immediate threat that this is going to push inflation above the 3% comfort zone. You now have an overnight rate that's at 2.75%. So to me, the floor really is probably around 2%. You could go below that. You could go as low as we had it in the worst of the COVID days, but I don't know that they want to go down to that level. I thought that at the beginning of this year, they had 4 interest rate cuts left in them. They've now already used up 2 of them. So there's maybe 2 left, and then we're starting to brush the bottom of where I would feel comfortable with the Bank of Canada going before it starts to signal that something's really wrong. To me, if they had held on to this interest rate cut, there is no inflationary pressure. The economy grew strongly at the end of last year, but I think that was a lot of businesses racing to get inventory across the U.S. border in anticipation of tariffs that were coming, rather than was a real sign of the Canadian economy's strength. And I think what we're going to see now is with the increasing uncertainty, business plans are going to start to go sideways. There's news coming out of Quebec right now that Northvolt has filed for bankruptcy. That was going to be a huge investment in Quebec for battery plant development. And that in itself is probably going to get canceled in Canada because of the uncertainty around the tariffs, more than just that the parent company has filed for bankruptcy. I think we're going to see more of that happening. And if these tariffs come in and they're increasing from 25 to 50%, or they're going back to 25%, or they're being suspended for a month, businesses are going to start to say, I can't do this anymore. And so whether they decide to just move to the US to avoid the tariffs going forward, or whether they just suspend any new projects until there's clarity, those are the types of things that can drag the Canadian economy down. But at the same time, the tariff threat does run the risk of spiking inflation. And so when the Bank of Canada is trying to look at this data, they're going to have a really difficult time trying to balance the two tensions, that one part of the story is clearly inflationary and the other part of the story clearly isn't. As long as they don't feel that there's inflationary tension, they can cut interest rates to try and prop up the economy. But inflation can appear very suddenly. And if it appears, I don't know that the Bank of Canada wants to start reversing the interest rate cycle or playing it as a yo-yo where it's up today and down tomorrow. So I think that at some point in the foreseeable future, they're going to have to pause these interest rates to just see which of these two tensions wins out. For now, they feel that the lower tension is stronger than the higher tension, but I just don't see that that's going to be sustainable in the face of all of this changing Trump policy.
British Columbia is ramping up efforts to recruit American doctors and nurses to come north. The province is working on fast-tracking the processes to recognize their credentials in the province. BC Health Minister Josie Osborne says the work will include a targeted marketing campaign in Washington, Oregon, and California this spring. Ms. Osborne says that the chaos of the U.S. trade war with Canada is an opportunity to attract American healthcare workers who'd like to move to Canada. Provincial police say they've charged 2 people from Mississauga, Ontario, after seizing more than 4,000 illegal cannabis plants in the Niagara region. Police say officers responded to a location on Highway 3 in Wainfleet on February 26th after a referral from Health Canada inspectors who said that cannabis was being illegally grown. They say officers found 4,098 cannabis plants and just over 15 kilograms of dried and processed cannabis. Police say that the total value of the cannabis is more than $2 million. A 58-year-old and 35-year-old have been charged with 2 offenses under the Cannabis Act, including possession of the drug for the purpose of distributing. The charges have not been tested in court, and the investigation is ongoing. U.S. federal investigators looking into January's fatal mid-air collision in Washington, D.C., recommended a ban on some helicopter flights in the area. A military helicopter collided with a passenger jet as it was approaching Ronald Reagan National Airport, killing 67 people. The National Transportation Safety Board chair says the board has determined the current rules on distance between planes and helicopters is insufficient.
We've determined that the existing separation distances between helicopter traffic operating on Route 4 and aircraft landing on runway 33 are insufficient and pose an intolerable risk to aviation safety by increasing the chances of a mid-air collision at DCA. Let me repeat that. They pose an intolerable risk to aviation safety. We're therefore recommending today that the FAA permanently prohibit operations on helicopter Route 4 between Haines Point and the Wilson Bridge when runways 15 and 33 are being used for departures and arrivals at DCA.
Guatemala's volcano of fire appeared calm on Tuesday, and nearly 300 families who had evacuated their home on its slope as it began erupting returned home. The volcano spewed gas and ash far into the sky on Monday, leading authorities to close schools in the vicinity and a key road connecting communities. On Tuesday, Guatemala's disaster agency confirmed that all of the families in shelters had returned to their home overnight, and the education ministry said that schools had reopened. Tiger Woods had a less invasive surgery for a ruptured Achilles tendon, keeping him out of the Masters. Woods posted the development on his social media accounts without saying how long he expected to be out or any other details except that the surgery went well. At the Players' Championship, Rory McIlroy spoke on Woods' injury, saying that he's hopeful that he'll play in 2026.
Yeah, it sucks. He doesn't have much luck when it comes to injuries in his body, and obviously he was trying to ramp up to get ready for Augusta, and Achilles surgeries aren't fun. So yeah, hope he's in good spirits and hoping he's doing okay. And we obviously won't see him play golf this year, and hopefully we see him maybe play in 2026.
Explorers have discovered the sunken wreckage of one of the first steel cargo ships to travel the Great Lakes. The Western Reserve sank during a gale on Lake Superior in August 1892. 27 people were killed, with wheelsman Harry W. Stewart as the lone survivor. Searchers from the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society used side-scanning sonar and an underwater drone in July to find the wreckage in about 600 feet of water, about 60 miles northwest of Whitefish Point on Michigan's Upper Peninsula. The society announced the finding on Saturday at the annual Ghost Ships Festival in Wisconsin. NASA's newest space telescope has blasted off to map the entire sky like never before. Launched last night from California by SpaceX, the Sphere X Observatory will survey the sky every 6 months from an orbit over Earth's poles. Its infrared instruments are expected to provide a sweeping, wide-angle view of hundreds of millions of galaxies and their shared cosmic glow. Scientists hope to learn how galaxies formed and evolved, and how the universe expanded so fast in its first moments. I'm Teresa Skubik, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. For more news on demand, you can always visit our website at forumdailynews.ca, and make sure to follow us on our social media handles on X and TikTok. You can also watch all of our commentary programming on the News Forum YouTube channel. Thanks for joining us on Forum Daily News. We'll see you next time. Good night, Canada.